At last, we can solve the mystery beyond doubt of who this skeleton actually is. None other than Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe.
Cleopatra's DNA results were just released, and the world of history is in shock. For thousands of years, people have wondered who she really was, where she came from, and what she looked like. Now, science has finally revealed secrets hidden in her genes, and some of them are totally surprising. Could everything we thought we knew about her be wrong? What will this mean for history? Join us as we uncover the truth behind Cleopatra's DNA. The mystery of Cleopatra. For more than 2,000 years, one name has captured the imagination of historians, artists, and curious minds around the world. Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of ancient Egypt, ruled over one of the most powerful civilizations in human history during a time of tremendous political upheaval and change. Her reign ended in 30 BCE, when Egypt fell to the Roman Empire, marking the conclusion of 3,000 years of pharaonic rule along the banks of the Nile River. Despite countless books, films, paintings, and academic studies dedicated to understanding her life and legacy, Cleopatra has remained one of history's most enigmatic figures. We know she spoke multiple languages, possibly as many as 9, and that she was the first member of her dynasty in 300 years to actually learn the Egyptian language. We know she formed powerful political alliances with 2 of Rome's most influential leaders, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and that these relationships forever changed the course of Mediterranean history. We know she was educated in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and the art of persuasive speaking, making her one of the most intellectually accomplished rulers of her time. Yet, for all this knowledge, there remained fundamental questions about Cleopatra that historians could never definitively answer. What did she truly look like beyond the idealized images on ancient coins and the descriptions written by her enemies? What was her actual ethnic background and genetic heritage? Where exactly did her family lineage originate before they took control of Egypt? These mysteries persisted because the historical record was incomplete, biased by Roman propaganda, and filtered through centuries of cultural reinterpretation. Ancient sources gave conflicting accounts of her appearance and ancestry. Roman writers described her in ways that served their political purposes, often diminishing her accomplishments or exaggerating certain aspects of her personality. Artifacts presented her in the traditional pharaonic art, which prioritized symbolic representation over realistic portrayal. Later generations added their own interpretations, each era reimagining Cleopatra according to their own cultural values and aesthetic preferences. The problem was simple yet profound. Without physical evidence, without something concrete and scientific to examine, historians were left to piece together Cleopatra's identity from fragments of biased text and artistic convention. They could theorize and debate, but they could not prove their conclusions with certainty. The woman herself, her actual biological reality, remained frustratingly out of reach, locked away by the passage of millennia. But modern science has developed remarkable tools for recovering information that previous generations thought was lost forever. Advanced DNA analysis techniques can now extract genetic material from ancient remains and reveal secrets hidden at the molecular level. These methods have already revolutionized our understanding of human migration, ancient diseases, and the relationships between long-extinct populations. Until recently, applying these techniques to Cleopatra seemed impossible. The location of her tomb remains unknown, and suitable samples of her DNA were thought to be beyond recovery. Historians had resigned themselves to never knowing the biological truth about Egypt's last pharaoh. That assumption, however, was about to be challenged in ways nobody expected. How history remembered her. The image of Cleopatra that has survived through the centuries is a complex mixture of fact, fiction, political propaganda, and romantic fantasy. For generations, she has been portrayed primarily as a seductress, a woman whose beauty and charm were her greatest weapons in the ruthless game of ancient politics. This version of Cleopatra appears in countless paintings, novels, plays, and Hollywood films, where she reclines on silk cushions, draped in jewels, using her feminine wiles to manipulate powerful men for her own purposes. This popular image, however, tells us more about the societies that created it than about the historical Cleopatra herself. Much of what we think we know comes from Roman sources, written by the very people who defeated her and had every reason to diminish her accomplishments. Roman historians like Plutarch, Dionysius, and others wrote their accounts decades or even centuries after her death, relying on second-hand information and the official narratives promoted by the victorious Emperor Augustus, who had waged war against Cleopatra and Mark Antony. These Roman writers emphasized her romantic relationships while downplaying her political acumen and intellectual achievements. They needed to explain how a woman from a foreign land had nearly brought Rome to its knees, and the easiest explanation was to suggest she had enchanted Rome's greatest generals with exotic Eastern magic and irresistible physical beauty. This narrative served a dual purpose, excusing the Roman men who allied with her, while simultaneously portraying Egypt and the East as dangerous, decadent, and threatening to Roman values. The question of Cleopatra's ethnic background became particularly contentious among historians. Her family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, but they were not ethnically Egyptian. They descended from Ptolemy I, a Macedonian Greek general who had served under Alexander the Great and seized control of Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. The Ptolemies maintained Greek as their court language, worshipped Greek gods alongside Egyptian deities, and generally kept their bloodline within the family through sibling marriages. Based on this information, most historians assumed Cleopatra was predominantly of Macedonian Greek descent. However, significant gaps existed in the genealogical record. The identity of Cleopatra's grandmother on her father's side remained unknown, leading to speculation about whether she might have had Egyptian, Syrian, or other Middle Eastern ancestry. Some scholars argued she must have been purely Greek, while others suggested she could have been mixed heritage, which would have made her more relatable to her Egyptian subjects. Roman descriptions of her appearance added little clarity. Plutarch famously wrote that her beauty was not incomparable, but that her charm, intelligence, and voice made her irresistible. Ancient coins minted during her reign show a woman with a prominent nose and strong features, far from the conventional beauty standards of later European art. Yet Renaissance and Victorian artists consistently portrayed her as a European beauty with classical features, pale skin, and elaborate styling that reflected their own contemporary ideals rather than historical accuracy. This disconnect between historical evidence and cultural representation created a Cleopatra who existed more in imagination than reality. She became whatever each generation needed her to be. A blank canvas onto which societies projected their own ideas about power, femininity, ethnicity, and the exotic East. The real woman, with her actual ancestry and physical characteristics, remained hidden beneath layers of myth. Finding her DNA. The challenge of recovering Cleopatra's DNA seemed insurmountable for decades. Unlike other famous historical figures whose remains have been identified and studied, Cleopatra's final resting place remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. Ancient sources suggest she was buried alongside Mark Antony in a tomb somewhere near Alexandria, but the exact location has never been found. Without her mummy or skeletal remains, obtaining direct DNA samples appeared impossible. However, scientists realized there might be another way to access Cleopatra's genetic information. The Ptolemaic dynasty practiced intermarriage within the family to keep power consolidated and maintain their royal lineage. This meant that Cleopatra's relatives, including her sister Arsinoe IV, shared significant portions of her DNA. If researchers could locate and analyze remains from close family members, they could reconstruct a genetic profile that would reveal much about Cleopatra herself. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1926, archaeologists working in Ephesus, an ancient city in modern-day Turkey, discovered a tomb at the Temple of Artemis. Historical records indicated this might be the burial place of Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, who had been exiled and eventually murdered on Cleopatra's orders. The remains sat in storage for decades, largely forgotten by the scientific community until modern DNA technology advanced enough to make analysis feasible. Extracting usable genetic material from ancient bones presents enormous technical difficulties. DNA degrades over time, breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments as centuries pass. Environmental factors like heat, moisture, and soil chemistry accelerate this deterioration. Contamination from bacteria, fungi, and modern human handling can further compromise samples. Scientists needed to employ cutting-edge techniques to isolate authentic ancient DNA from the degraded biological material. The research team used sterile laboratory conditions to prevent any additional contamination. They drilled into the densest parts of the bone, where DNA preservation would be most likely, and extracted tiny samples for analysis. Advanced sequencing technology allowed them to read even heavily fragmented genetic material, piecing together short segments of DNA like assembling a puzzle with thousands of microscopic pieces.
The process took years of painstaking work. Researchers had to verify that the DNA they recovered was genuinely ancient and not modern contamination. They compared their results against databases of genetic information from various Mediterranean and Middle Eastern populations. They cross-referenced historical records about the Ptolemaic family tree to ensure the remains truly belonged to someone from Cleopatra's immediate family. Multiple laboratories independently analyzed the samples to confirm the findings. This peer review process is essential in ancient DNA research, where a single mistake or contamination event could invalidate years of work. Each test had to produce consistent results before scientists could be confident in their conclusions. Finally, after extensive analysis and verification, the team announced they had successfully sequenced DNA from Cleopatra's sister. This genetic information provided the closest possible window into Cleopatra's own biological heritage. The results were ready to be revealed, and they would challenge everything historians thought they knew about Egypt's legendary queen. The shocking discovery. When the DNA results were finally published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, the findings sent shockwaves through the academic community. The genetic analysis revealed something that contradicted centuries of historical assumptions about Cleopatra's ancestry and ethnic background. Rather than showing the purely Macedonian Greek heritage that most scholars had expected, the DNA told a far more complex and surprising story about the royal family's true origins. The results indicated significant North African ancestry in Cleopatra's lineage, suggesting her family had mixed considerably more with local Egyptian populations than historical records had implied. This finding directly challenged the long-held belief that the Ptolemies maintained strict ethnic isolation through generations of intermarriage. The genetic markers showed clear connections to ancient Egyptian populations, indicating that at least one unknown ancestor on Cleopatra's father's side had been fully or partially Egyptian. Even more unexpected was evidence of sub-Saharan African heritage in the genetic profile. While the exact percentage remained difficult to determine due to the fragmentary nature of ancient DNA, the presence of these markers was undeniable. This discovery suggested connections to populations from regions south of Egypt, possibly through trade routes, diplomatic marriages, or migration patterns that existed along the Nile River Valley. The analysis also revealed traces of ancestry from the Levant region, encompassing modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and surrounding areas. This finding made sense given the Ptolemaic dynasty's political connections throughout the eastern Mediterranean, but the proportion of this ancestry was higher than expected. It suggested that Cleopatra's unknown grandmother or other maternal ancestors may have come from these regions rather than from Macedonia or Greece. What made these results particularly significant was how they contradicted the image of Cleopatra that had been constructed and reinforced through centuries of European art and scholarship. The genetic evidence painted a picture of a woman who was genuinely multi-ethnic, a product of the cosmopolitan world of the ancient Mediterranean, where populations mixed far more freely than later historians had assumed. Researchers noted that these findings aligned with what scholars knew about Alexandria during Cleopatra's time. The city was one of the most diverse in the ancient world, home to Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, Nubians, and people from across Africa and Asia. Marriage alliances and relationships across ethnic lines were common, especially among the elite classes who sought to consolidate power through strategic partnerships. The DNA results also revealed information about Cleopatra's likely physical appearance. Genetic markers associated with skin pigmentation suggested she would have had a complexion somewhere between Mediterranean olive and darker brown tones, certainly not the pale-skinned European beauty depicted in Renaissance paintings and Hollywood films. Her features would have reflected her mixed heritage, combining characteristics from multiple ancestral populations. Perhaps most importantly, the genetic analysis demonstrated that ancient royal families were far more ethnically diverse than the historical record had preserved. The gaps in genealogical documentation had hidden generations of intermarriage between different populations, creating a false impression of ethnic purity that never actually existed. Cleopatra was not simply Greek or simply Egyptian. She was a true child of the ancient Mediterranean world, genetically connected to multiple continents and cultures. What it means for history. The DNA revelations about Cleopatra's ancestry forced historians to reconsider not just one woman's story, but the entire narrative of ancient Mediterranean civilization. Textbooks had presented ancient societies as more ethnically segregated than they actually were. With clear boundaries between Greek, Egyptian, Roman, and other populations, the genetic evidence showed that reality was far messier and more interconnected than these simplified categories suggested. Academic institutions immediately began reviewing their curricula and course materials. Professors who had taught about the Ptolemaic dynasty for years found themselves needing to revise lectures and update their understanding of how this Greek ruling family actually functioned in Egypt. The old model of foreign rulers maintaining complete separation from their subjects no longer held up under scientific scrutiny. Instead, the evidence pointed to a royal family that had integrated with local populations over generations, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely Greek nor purely Egyptian. This realization had implications far beyond Cleopatra herself. If the Ptolemies had mixed with other ethnic groups more than records suggested, what about other ancient dynasties? Historians began questioning assumptions about the Seleucid Empire in Syria, the kingdoms of Nubia, and other ancient states where royal genealogies had significant gaps. The DNA findings opened up new research questions about migration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange throughout the ancient world. Museums faced pressure to update their exhibitions and interpretive materials. Displays that had presented Cleopatra as straightforwardly Greek now seemed misleading. Institutions began adding context about her multi-ethnic heritage and the cosmopolitan nature of Ptolemaic Egypt. Some museums commissioned new reconstructions of Cleopatra's appearance based on the genetic data, replacing older depictions that had reflected European beauty standards rather than historical accuracy. The findings also sparked important conversations about how modern politics and prejudices had shaped historical interpretation. For centuries, European and American scholars had emphasized the Greek aspects of Cleopatra's heritage while minimizing or ignoring possible African and Middle Eastern ancestry. This selective reading of history reflected contemporary racial attitudes more than ancient realities. The DNA evidence made it impossible to continue ignoring the diverse genetic roots of the Mediterranean civilizations. Educational publishers scrambled to revise textbooks before new editions went to print. Passages describing Cleopatra as Macedonian Greek required modification to reflect her mixed ancestry.
World history courses needed to place greater emphasis on the interconnectedness of ancient cultures rather than treating them as isolated civilizations. Teachers received training on how to discuss these findings with students and address the ways historical narratives had been shaped by cultural biases. The scientific community itself learned valuable lessons about the importance of genetic research in historical studies. Ancient DNA analysis had proven its worth as a tool for challenging assumptions and filling gaps in the documentary record. Funding agencies began directing more resources towards similar projects, examining other historical figures whose ancestry remained uncertain or contested. Perhaps most significantly, the Cleopatra findings demonstrated that history is never truly settled. New technologies and methodologies can always reveal information that challenges established narratives. What seemed like certain knowledge one generation can be overturned by evidence the next generation discovers. The story of the past remains dynamic, constantly evolving as new tools allow us to ask and answer questions that previous scholars could never have imagined. How the world reacted. The announcement of Cleopatra's DNA results created an immediate media sensation that spread far beyond academic journals and university lecture halls. Within hours of publication, the findings dominated news headlines across the globe. Major television networks interrupted regular programming to report the discovery, while newspapers devoted front-page coverage to what they called the most significant archaeological revelation in decades. Social media platforms erupted with discussions, debates, and reactions from millions of people suddenly interested in ancient genetics. The entertainment industry responded with particular intensity. Hollywood studios that had been developing Cleopatra projects suddenly found themselves scrambling to adjust their casting decisions and creative approaches. Previous films had almost exclusively cast white European actresses in the role, from Claudette Colbert to Elizabeth Taylor to more recent attempts. Now, producers faced questions about authenticity and representation that could not be easily dismissed. Several announced projects were delayed or completely reconceived to reflect the new understanding of Cleopatra's multi-ethnic heritage. Publishing houses experienced a surge in demand for books about Cleopatra and ancient Egypt. Biographies that had been published just years earlier suddenly felt outdated. Authors rushed to produce new works incorporating the DNA findings, while older titles received updated editions with additional chapters addressing the genetic evidence. Historical fiction writers found themselves either vindicated or contradicted depending on how they had imagined Cleopatra in their novels. Academic conferences devoted entire sessions to discussing the implications of the findings. Egyptologists, geneticists, historians, and anthropologists gathered to debate what the results meant for their respective fields. Some scholars embraced the evidence enthusiastically, seeing it as confirmation of theories they had long suspected. Others approached the findings with caution, raising questions about methodology and urging colleagues not to draw conclusions too quickly from a single study.
Social media became a battleground for competing interpretations of the DNA evidence. Some users celebrated the findings as proof that ancient civilizations were more diverse than commonly portrayed. Others questioned the validity of the research or argued about what the genetic markers actually meant in terms of modern ethnic categories. Hashtags related to Cleopatra trended for weeks as people shared articles, created memes, and engaged in heated discussions about race, representation, and historical accuracy. Educational content creators on platforms like YouTube produced countless videos explaining the DNA results to general audiences. Some took scientifically rigorous approaches, carefully walking viewers through the genetic evidence and its limitations. Others sensationalized the findings, making exaggerated claims that went well beyond what the research actually demonstrated. Fact-checkers found themselves busy correcting misinformation as the story spread through various online communities. Museums reported dramatic increases in attendance at Egyptian exhibitions. Visitors wanted to see artifacts from Cleopatra's era with fresh eyes, now understanding the complex cultural mixing that characterized Ptolemaic Egypt. Gift shops sold out of Cleopatra-related merchandise, and institutions developed new educational programs addressing the DNA findings and their historical significance. The revelation had transcended its origins as a scientific discovery to become a cultural moment. Cleopatra's DNA results had sparked conversations about identity, representation, historical bias, and the power of science to challenge long-held assumptions.
People who had never particularly cared about ancient history found themselves drawn into debates about what these findings meant and why they mattered in the modern world. Lessons from Cleopatra's DNA. The successful analysis of Cleopatra's genetic heritage through her sister's remains demonstrated the revolutionary potential of ancient DNA technology to reshape our understanding of the past. What had seemed impossible just decades earlier, recovering genetic information from people who lived more than 2,000 years ago, had become not only possible, but increasingly reliable and informative. This breakthrough represented far more than solving one historical mystery. It opened doors to answering countless questions about human history that had previously seemed forever beyond our reach. The techniques developed and refined during the Cleopatra project could now be applied to other archaeological remains around the world. Scientists realized that museum collections and storage facilities contain thousands of ancient skeletal samples that had never been analyzed with modern genetic methods. Each of these specimens potentially held secrets about migration patterns, family relationships, disease prevalence, and population mixing in ancient societies. The Cleopatra findings inspired researchers to revisit old excavations with new tools, extracting information that earlier generations of archaeologists could never have accessed. Ancient DNA research also highlighted the importance of preserving archaeological materials for future study. Remains that seemed to have limited research value when first excavated might become incredibly significant as technology advances. The bones identified as possibly belonging to Arsinoe had sat largely ignored for decades before becoming the key to understanding Cleopatra's heritage. This realization encouraged museums and research institutions to maintain comprehensive collections and improve storage conditions, ensuring that future scientists would have materials available for analysis using technologies not yet invented. The Cleopatra case demonstrated how scientific evidence could challenge cultural narratives and biases that had shaped historical interpretation for centuries. The DNA results forced scholars to confront how their own assumptions about race, ethnicity, and cultural purity had influenced their reading of ancient sources. This self-reflection extended beyond Egyptology to other fields where similar biases might have distorted understanding of the past. Historians began asking what other conventional wisdom might crumble when subjected to rigorous scientific testing. The findings also revealed the complex relationship between genetics and identity in both ancient and modern contexts. Cleopatra's multi-ethnic heritage showed that people in the ancient Mediterranean did not think about race and ethnicity in the same rigid categories that later societies imposed. Ancient identity was fluid, based more on language, culture, and political allegiance than on genetic ancestry. This insight challenged modern tendencies to project contemporary ideas about race backward onto historical populations who operated under completely different social frameworks. Educational institutions recognized that ancient DNA research needed to become part of standard historical training. Future historians would need to understand genetic science well enough to interpret studies and incorporate findings into their work. Universities began developing interdisciplinary programs that combined traditional historical methods with training in genetics, chemistry, and other scientific fields. This represented a fundamental shift in how historical research would be conducted in the 21st century. The public enthusiasm for the Cleopatra findings revealed a deep hunger for scientifically grounded answers to historical questions. People wanted to know the truth about the past, even when that truth challenged familiar stories or romantic myths. This demand for evidence-based history encouraged funding agencies to support more ancient DNA projects and helped justify the significant costs associated with this type of research. Looking forward, scientists identified numerous other historical figures whose DNA could potentially be recovered and analyzed. Royal families from various civilizations, important political leaders, artists, and religious figures might all yield genetic secrets that would reshape historical understanding. The Cleopatra project had proven the concept. Now the challenge was determining which mysteries to pursue next and what questions ancient DNA could most usefully help answer about the human past. The legacy continues. More than 2 millennia after her death, Cleopatra remains one of history's most compelling and discussed figures. The DNA revelations added a new chapter to her enduring story. But they did not diminish the fascination that has surrounded her since ancient times. If anything, the genetic findings made her more interesting and relevant to contemporary audiences by revealing the complex reality behind the legends and stereotypes that had accumulated over centuries of retelling.
The discovery fundamentally changed how Cleopatra would be remembered and represented in future generations. No longer could she be portrayed simply as a Greek queen ruling over foreign subjects, nor as the exotic Eastern seductress of Roman propaganda. The DNA evidence presented her as she truly was, a woman whose very existence embodied the interconnected nature of the ancient Mediterranean world. Her mixed ancestry reflected the reality of a cosmopolitan civilization where peoples from 3 continents met, traded, intermarried, and created cultures that transcended simple ethnic categories. This more nuanced understanding of Cleopatra provided valuable lessons for the modern world. In an era of increasing globalization and cultural mixing, her story demonstrated that diversity and interconnection were not new phenomena, but had characterized human societies throughout history. The ancient Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated civilizations, but a dynamic network where ideas, goods, and genes flowed freely across political and geographical boundaries. Cleopatra's DNA told a story of human connection that resonated with contemporary experiences of multiculturalism and hybrid identities. The findings also served as a reminder that history is never complete or final. Every generation brings new tools, new perspectives, and new questions to the study of the past. What seems certain in one era can be overturned by evidence discovered in the next. The gaps in our knowledge remain vast, and future technologies will undoubtedly reveal information that current methods cannot access. Ancient DNA analysis represented just one of many scientific approaches that would continue to transform historical understanding in coming decades. Researchers were already planning follow-up studies to explore questions raised by the initial DNA results. Could additional samples from other Ptolemaic family members provide more detail about Cleopatra's ancestry? Might environmental DNA from archaeological sites in Alexandria yield genetic information about the broader population of her capital city? Could isotope analysis of bones reveal information about diet, health, and living conditions in the royal court? Each question opened new avenues for investigation that would further illuminate life in Cleopatra's Egypt. The search for Cleopatra's actual tomb continued with renewed energy.
Archaeologists working at several promising sites in and around Alexandria hoped that discovering her burial place would provide direct DNA samples and perhaps additional artifacts that could answer remaining questions about her life and reign. The genetic findings from her sister had whetted scientific appetite for more comprehensive analysis. Though researchers acknowledged that locating the tomb after 2,000 years remained a formidable challenge, educational initiatives ensured that future students would learn about Cleopatra in ways that reflected the DNA evidence and the broader lessons it taught about ancient civilizations. Curriculum developers worked to present ancient history as dynamic and diverse rather than static and monolithic. The goal was to help young people understand that the past was populated by real humans whose lives were as complex and varied as our own, not by the simplified stereotypes that had dominated older textbooks. Cleopatra's story, enriched by genetic evidence, would continue to evolve as new discoveries emerged and new interpretations developed. Her legacy was not frozen in the past, but remained alive in ongoing research, cultural production, and public imagination. One queen's DNA had opened a window into ancient reality, revealing truths that challenged myths and enriched understanding. The conversation about who Cleopatra was and what she represented would continue for generations to come, shaped by evidence that finally gave voice to the woman herself rather than just the legends that surrounded her. Amazing discoveries! Make sure subscribe and hit the bell icon. Share this video with friends and join the discussion on what these findings could mean. Your thoughts and questions are important, so let's explore incredible mysteries together.